Hi, this is Matt Baker. Last month, I started a new series on the psychology of atheism based on my PhD thesis. In part one, I mostly talked about terminology, explaining the differences between negative and positive atheism, as well as between implicit and explicit atheism. If you haven't yet watched that video, you can find a link to it in the description. In this episode, I'm going to dive into the core of my research, which was about the personality differences between atheists and theists. In particular, I focused on individuals who grew up attending church, comparing those who went on to become atheists as adults with those who became theists. But first, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Wondrium, previously known as the Great Courses. If you're like me and love learning new things, then Wondrium is the place for you. It's an educational streaming platform full of tutorials, travelogues, documentaries, and even complete courses taught by experts. They are constantly adding new content, such as this 15-part documentary added just today called Searching for the Historical Jesus. It's presented by Jean-Pierre Isbouts, one of National Geographic's best-selling authors. You can sign up for a free trial by going to wondrium.com/usefulcharts or by using the link in the description or pinned comment. And keep in mind that Wondrium makes a great gift. So, with the holiday season coming up, you may have just found the perfect gift for that special someone. Okay, when it comes to personality theories, the gold standard within the field of psychology is the Big Five theory. This theory was developed by taking thousands of adjectives from the English language, ones that are commonly used to describe people, and then using a statistical technique called factor analysis to see which words tended to cluster together the most. This method revealed that human personalities can be broken down into five main components. These are extroversion, openness to new experiences, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism. Decades of research, including studies using other languages, has continued to back up this theory. There is even evidence nowadays that genetics plays at least some role in the development of these five components. Now, in my own research, I actually used a slightly different personality theory, one that involves these letters. And from the comments on part one, I know that some of you found this to be quite surprising. This is because these letters are mostly associated with the proprietary questionnaire known as the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, or MBTI. And there is a lot of skepticism surrounding the Myers-Briggs test, with some even describing it as being the equivalent of astrology. But the truth of the matter is actually a bit more nuanced, so let me explain. At the most basic level, the Myers-Briggs simply determines where a person stands on four specific measures of personality. Now, what most people don't know is that these four measures actually match almost perfectly onto four of the big five personality traits. The EI scale being a rough measure of extroversion, the SN scale being a rough measure of openness, the TF scale being a rough measure of agreeableness, and the JP scale being a rough measure of conscientiousness. The only one missing being neuroticism. However, the problem with the Myers-Briggs is that it takes things beyond this in two notable ways. First, it combines your score on these four measures and then places you in one of 16 types, which it then goes on to describe as a whole. It is this use of whole type to predict things like career or romantic success that can be problematic due to what's called the Barnum effect. The second problem is that the Myers-Briggs is based on certain Jungian theories involving certain underlying psychological functions that have never been empirically shown to actually exist. So to sum up, if you take the four Myers-Briggs scales as being four independent measures of personality, they are actually quite useful and accurate. In fact, they pass the crucial tests of validity and reliability quite well. So, with that said, here's why I chose to use the Myers-Briggs instead of simply relying on the Big Five. First, the Myers-Briggs uses terminology that is much more neutral. And since we're talking about religious beliefs, I think that being neutral is very important. So, for example, the Big Five theory uses terms like agreeable and conscientious, both of which have very positive connotations. To call someone not very agreeable or not very conscientious seems like a value judgment is being made. Secondly, the Myers-Briggs is quite popular, and therefore a lot of people are familiar with it. Being more of a public educator than an ivory tower academic, I wanted the results from my PhD thesis to be something that the average person could easily understand and discuss. Finally, we already know what the correlations between the Big Five and religiosity are, and therefore I wanted to do something new. If my data were to show that a different but related personality measure came up with the same result, that would be adding something to the field's body of knowledge, which is what a PhD thesis is supposed to do. So, with all that out of the way, let me quickly explain to you what the Myers-Briggs letters mean for those who have never heard of them or need a refresher. And then after that, I'll reveal to you the findings from my study. So the first scale is E for extrovert versus I for introvert. Extroverts are energized by being around other people and tend to be quite talkative and quick to speak, whereas introverts are energized by spending time alone and tend to be more shy and contemplative. Now, obviously, each person can be a bit of both, depending on the situation. But generally speaking, most people tend to lean one way or the other. So, as I go through these terms, you can decide for yourself where you might fall. And if you want to, it might help to write down your answers. So, if you think you're more of an extrovert, write down E. However, if you're more of an introvert, write down I. Next is S for sensor versus N for intuitive. Sensors tend to be more practical and detail-focused, preferring to work with things that are real and concrete. They also tend to be quite observant and good at using their five senses to gather information. In contrast, intuitives tend to be more theoretical, focusing on the big picture and on abstract ideas. They often have an intuitive sense of the connections between things and are good at coming up with creative solutions. So, once again, which one sounds more like you? If it's the left side, write down S. If it's the right side, write N. The third set of letters is T for thinking versus F for feeling. Thinkers tend to make decisions based more on their head, using logic, whereas feelers tend to make decisions based more on their heart, using their internal value system. So, stereotypically, scientists tend to be thinkers, whereas poets tend to be feelers. Now, again, obviously, one can be both a scientist and a poet, and most people use both their head and their heart, depending on the situation. So, let me remind you, we're talking about generalities here. Are you generally the type of person who likes to rely more on straightforward facts and principles when making decisions, even if it leads to conflict? If so, write T. However, if you're generally the type of person who is more concerned with other people's feelings and in promoting values such as compassion and harmony, then write F. Finally, we have J for judger versus P for perceiver. Judgers tend to be more structured and organized and prefer to reach closure when it comes to decision making. In other words, they like to make judgments about things. That doesn't mean that they are judgmental. It just means that they like to plan everything out carefully. Perceivers, on the other hand, like to keep things open. They tend to be more flexible and adaptable and prefer to go with the flow. This is because they are constantly perceiving, meaning that they are always on the lookout for more information. So if you like firm plans, write J. However, if you prefer to keep things more open-ended, write P. So you should now have 4 letters written down. For me, I have INFP. I'm pretty sure about the I, the N, and the P, but I'm on the fence between the T and the F. But since I had to choose something, I decided to go with F. So these 4 letters represent your Myers-Briggs type. If you Google your 4-letter code, you'll find lots of information about what people with your particular combination tend to be like. Some of it you might find to be quite accurate, whereas other parts not so much. It can be quite fun and is good for starting conversations, but like I said earlier, you should take most of it with a grain of salt. That's because if we want to be scientific about it, we shouldn't concern ourselves with Myers-Briggs types as a whole, but instead see the 4 letters as simply being a rough measure of one's big 5 personality traits. So for me, as an INFP, this means that I am probably low extroversion, high openness, high agreeableness, and low conscientiousness. However, like I said earlier, the Myers-Briggs is still useful in that a lot of people tend to be familiar with it and perhaps even remember their type, which means that I can now present my findings to you in a fairly easy-to-understand, neutral way. So once again, the main focus of my research was to look at the personality differences between those who grew up attending church and became atheists as adults with those who grew up attending church and became theists as adults. My atheist sample consisted of 10,525 participants, whereas my theist sample consisted of 1,977 participants. And a brief comment about the sampling method. In the previous video, I mentioned that my survey went viral thanks to being posted on places like the Atheism subreddit. This led some people to assume that my survey was basically a survey of Reddit users rather than everyday atheists. However, let me clarify that most of the people who participated in my research survey did not find the survey directly from Reddit. Rather, having it posted at places like Reddit simply helped it to go viral. This method of sampling is known as snowball sampling and can be useful in circumstances where it's not as easy to find a certain group of people, such as atheists. Okay, with that said, here's what I learned. Among females, the 3 types that were the most likely to be atheist were ISTP, INTP, and ISTJ. And the 3 that were the least likely to be atheist were ENFP, ESFJ, and ENFJ. Among males, the 3 types that were the most likely to be atheist were ISTP, ESTP, and INTP. And the 3 that were the least likely to be atheist were INFJ, ESFJ, and ENFJ. In both cases, it was the last 2 letters that made the biggest difference. For females, participants with the TP combination were 5 times more likely than those with the FJ combination to be atheists. And for males, participants with the TP combination were 6 times more likely than those with the FJ combination to be atheists. So quite clearly, it was the TF and JP scales that were the most important. And this was exactly what I expected to find based on what we already knew from Big 5 research. In a meta-analysis of 71 studies from 19 different countries, it was determined that the 2 measures that are the most important when it comes to how religious a person is are agreeableness and conscientiousness. In Big 5 terms, people who score high on both agreeableness and conscientiousness tend to be more religious, whereas people who score low on both agreeableness and conscientiousness tend to be less religious. Scoring F and J on the Myers-Briggs is basically the same as scoring high on both agreeableness and conscientiousness. And scoring T and P on the Myers-Briggs is basically the same as scoring low on both agreeableness and conscientiousness. So the results fit. However, like I mentioned earlier, the ability to now state the correlation using Myers-Briggs terminology instead of just Big 5 terminology allows us to now discuss the matter using less value-laden words. While scoring low on agreeableness may seem like a negative thing, this is not necessarily the case. People with low agreeableness are more likely to be nonconformist, which can be a good thing, particularly if what everyone is conforming to is wrong. Likewise, scoring low on conscientiousness also sounds like it's a negative thing. But those who score low on conscientiousness tend to be less stubborn, which again can be a good thing, because sometimes it's good to change one's thoughts and behaviors. So you can see why using T versus F and J versus P might be a better way to communicate this. In Myers-Briggs lingo, preferring thinking just means that a person prefers to make decisions based on logic rather than on other people's feelings. And preferring perceiving simply means that a person prefers to remain flexible in their beliefs rather than lock into something that may turn out to be wrong. So when it comes to atheists, this all makes a lot of sense. If someone grows up attending church and has a personality with the components T and P, they're going to, first of all, use logic to question what the church is teaching them, and second, be more willing to change their thinking if necessary. In contrast, those with the personality components F and J are going to be more likely to simply want to get along with others and stick to what they've been taught. Now, don't get me wrong. None of this actually has anything to do with whether or not God actually exists, or whether what a particular church teaches is right or wrong. It's simply about how one's personality might impact what one ends up believing or not believing. On top of this, it's also important to remember the oft-quoted phrase that correlation does not imply causation. In other words, being an ISTP does not make a person an atheist, nor does being an ENFJ make a person a theist. And although it's more rare, it's definitely still possible to be an ISTP and believe in God, or to be an ENFJ and be an atheist. Studies like mine are simply about what is more or less likely and how this might help us explain certain observed phenomenon. Okay, so this was just a summary of the main findings from my PhD research. I was also able to make a bunch of other comparisons as well, such as looking at the personality differences between Christian converts versus those who grew up attending church. If you want to read the entire paper, I'll leave a link to it in the description. Finally, my study also involved testing several other competing theories about why certain people become atheists, including some rather outlandish theories, such as that atheists are just arrogant, or angry, or immoral. So, in the final episode of this series, part 3, I'll be revealing the results from some of these other things that I looked into. I hope to have that available before the end of the year. Until then, I once again remind you to check out Wondrium. Thanks for watching.